welcome. That was a really good preliminary discussion that we just had that nobody will ever hear. So I think the reason that that I thought it would be good for us to have a chat a little bit about not the future of ACRAWSA, because that's silly. The future is ongoing and it's remade every day and so on. But I guess it's the ongoing work that's happening with ACRAWSA and how powerful that is, and also the opportunities that we're exploring as well. So I just thought it would be good for us to have a chat about that. It's a hard thing to just put it out as a blog for people to read. Sometimes it just is easier to see some of the personal interactions, I think. So, so I mean, that's it in a nutshell. I've got some thoughts around it as well, of course. But can I ask you, like, just a fundamental question?
Yeah.
Why do you, because it's so much work, Tess, why do you, why did you take on president?
It's really interesting, I think, what motivates people to do different things. And for me, I mean, I can get quite personal and relational, I guess, in terms of talking about my experiences. But my whole life, I felt like I never really could use my voice. Like, I'm a singer who doesn't use their voice. And so there's this interesting pushback that I do, this kind of dance I've done in my whole life that's about, oh, I need to be silent, or I need to not say things, or I don't really have enough to say, or I don't have important things to say, but I'll say something. And that's my, you know, I worked in creative work previously in live theatre. You know, I worked in sort of, you know, government roles where, you know, it just didn't work because I'd do that and then I'd say something. I, you know, went into academic spaces exactly in that way. And for many years, I played the compliant person that just went, yep, absolutely. And through the knowledge building that I've gathered and being able to put, you know, names to things, to feelings, and language, you know, scholarly language to that, I realised that actually I do have a voice, and, you know, whether it's the strongest one in the room, it doesn't really matter. It's still a voice. And I just think there's so many people of colour that feel like this. There's so many people that are gender diverse that feel like this. There's so many spaces where we feel we can't speak. And I actually have things to say. And I have things to say with regards to race and whiteness, you know, and interplay in the studies that we do, the different areas in which we study, and the different areas in which people work, you know, in community orgs and things like that, where race and whiteness is their everyday experience. It's their everyday experience, whether they're in when they're in a workplace, whether they're at home, whether they're at a university. And so all of that combined, you know, I thought, no, this is important, and I want to see something build from this. ACRAWSA has been, you know, going for some time, and it's done some amazing work. And the people that have come before us have done some, you know, incredible work. And I never want to not acknowledge that. But, you know, we're here now, and the space that I want to contribute to means that we have conversations about race and whiteness in critical ways, but also in, you know, in our true experience, in how we're living our lives, you know, and across different areas, including sort of creative work. So that was, you know, me in a nutshell, I guess, as to what my motivations were.
Oh, that's brilliant. And I think it also speaks to your focus as well in terms of some of the directions that we're taking with ACRAWSA. It's, for me, it's been it was wonderful hearing that. What you've just said was incredibly eloquent. It explains a lot, but I think also for a lot of junior scholars or people who have just started to think about what critical race and whiteness, both as studies and just more broadly, might be contemplating, and also what they may not know. And, part of that is to realise that there's so much more scholarly material now by people of colour, absolutely, by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the local context, but also just a lot more experience-based writing, but also that other, writing across every discipline, writing across every field, writing across every area, because I don't see myself as, for instance, a race scholar or somebody who is writing specifically in that space, but I also don't imagine how I wouldn't, so it's, and I think this is true of the multiple disciplines that engage with the wonderful work that's happened, across this space. Just to look at, it's the 20th anniversary, obviously, of distinguished Professor Eileen Morton Robinson's Talking Up to the White Woman, and that is such a crucial central text for people to engage with. And I'm reminded of the work that she's done across ACRAWSA over the life of it, but also of, how much people engage with that work and other work like it and use it to challenge, but also how many people don't engage with that material across our disciplines. And it's a concern that there's not more of a kind of a grittiness to, the difficult conversations. And you talked about that, and we know that there are two ways that you will engage resistance, and one is through desperation and the other is through privilege. And and we often through life have, like, a balance of these as well, if we're lucky, and actually I should say fortunate, though sometimes it's lucky, right? But I think there's a opportunity to, to allow people who don't necessarily inhabit that space to understand that, but also to challenge some of the material that's out there at the moment. There's obviously been a big criticism, including by me, but by people who are much more skilled at this than I am, around concerns with D'Angelo's White Fragility, for instance. It's a text that's like a textbook for how to not be racist, as though that's a thing. And, and it is problematic, it's simplistic. And for scholars to be engaging only in those spaces of just the challenge doesn't really grow our area. And of course, the work that happens in critical race then becomes critical to that. And then beyond that, the work that we do across all of the disciplines and bring into that helps to bolster that work, I think. And we hope that's going to happen with the journal, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. And, I guess, for me, coming on as president on the eve of a global pandemic has been really interesting.
Yeah.
It's been, and there's been a sort of a multitude of things, and I don't want to necessarily sort of, go down a poor me line, but, I was in a precarious, and still am in a precarious role, in an institution, a casual role. I'm a name without a face in my role, which is starting to change, in the work of embedding Indigenous knowledges. And I find that even quite an interesting space to talk about in terms of this work. Because if I mention, and I have mentioned to our Vice-Chancellor last year, I used the phrase critical race studies, and he couldn't get me out of the room fast enough. It's not something that I think institutions are necessarily comfortable with. And so, you know, even in the way in which we enact, you know, our work on a daily basis is engaging with this space, but having to do it in a way that also protects us, you know, because, you know, all the conversations about the labour that, you know, we have to put in regards to institutions and, you know, that potentially they can be quite violent and all those sorts of conversations. So, you know, I've had to, for the last sort of year previous to 2020, I've had to do that in a really sneaky way to embed, you know, critical race, you know, by embedding Indigenous knowledges and hope that they don't necessarily see what I'm doing. And it's a ridiculous way to have to sort of to behave when you just want to be, you know, like a deadly, or you just want to be someone that's just going, look, here, this is the work that needs to be done. I've now moved into a position where I have a little bit more power in that space, and maybe I would not have been able to do that had I not played that game, and it's a ridiculous game to play. But getting back to talking about 2020, where even at the conference, you know, we had the wonderful Sisters I come and do her performance of the poem God as a Woman. You know, there was artistic and creative sort of conversations that were being had with regards to race. And so that showed me that there already was sort of this shift into talking about the same thing, but talking about it in a multitude of ways. So, you know, that combined with precarity, combined with global pandemic and everyone now having to talk to each other on a screen for who knows how long, means that, and I don't like using the word pivot, but we've had to sort of necessarily sort of shift our ways of thinking. But also, I think it's just been a hard year for everybody. And, you know, being in hard lockdown in Melbourne and talking to other academics in hard lockdown in Melbourne, you know, the exhaustion that they feel in dealing with everything that's happening, in having to constantly engage with these often uncomfortable conversations, and still do the workload that they were meant to do sort of prior to 2020, has been really difficult. But it means that there's opportunities for, I guess, different ways of being and different ways of doing. And that's where I'm sort of trying to look at with regards to the journal, I think.
Yeah, I actually think it's just a very powerful moment too, because obviously everything about the pandemic has been difficult, but one thing that has changed for me, and I'm in a very privileged position, you know, in terms of having institutional support and having money and funding, but I'm not having to necessarily travel and pay for going to a lot of conferences. They're much more accessible, but I'm reminded of what that really means. And the real gift of that is that I get to be in those spaces with PhD students, with so many of my colleagues that are in the precarity, and, you know, in ways that just didn't happen before. And I hope that that's maintained, you know, and that's one of the powerful things about these discussions, that they can be international and national, and it doesn't necessarily involve having to physically be in the same space. I think too, you know, one of the really powerful negative criticisms that I was really hearing what you were saying about the structures that need to be interrogated but also demolished. And, you know, there's this kind of sequence and approval and idea of what's the right thing to do that gets trotted out constantly. I mean, a really good example of that is the sequence of acknowledgement of country. I'm here from, you know, I'm on Gubbi Gubbi country. I'm so grateful to Gubbi Gubbi people for making this space, sustaining this space, and being here, you know, and them being here and allowing me to be here. And those spaces of resistance I'm really grateful for too. The notion of let's acknowledge people at the beginning of us talking and then let's go, oh, well, no, now we'll move on to other things, is part of, you know, what you can disrupt when you start to disrupt ideas of the length of something, the idea that, you know, that we could, as far as you people out there know, be chatting for several hours. We're not going to be, but, you know, we could be. And, you know, being able to not just have it as a kind of agenda that goes acknowledgement, 5 minutes, you know, 2 minutes or 1 minute, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, acknowledgement should be bespoke because it is. I mean, I feel a level of gratefulness today to Gubbi Gubbi country, but also I always feel a level of acknowledgement. But it's not always front of my mind as feeling grateful, whether I like that or not, you know, and I think these are the kinds of truth in sequence that we have to honour, you know, and understand. So, you know, and also enact. And, you know, in some ways, and, you know, I know this might be drawing a long bow, but in some ways I think that connects back to the idea of the journal as something that creates a space where all kinds of scholarly forms are possible. And I use the term scholarly because I work in creative practice outcomes. They are scholarly. You know, if they contain research, if they're demonstrating research, and research is broadly framed, but it really is about the idea of new knowledge being presented and being contextualized for an audience, and for a reader, but also for people who are engaging with the material. And writing is not always the best way to disseminate that material. It's not always the best way to demonstrate the material. And so having those other forms becomes incredibly important, but also in that same way as the whole idea of the 2-minute acknowledgement followed by stuff that has nothing to do with it. I think that, you know, one of the crucial points is that you can have a journal that doesn't have to conform to a particular word count as well. You know, there are some conventions that make sense. You know, it makes sense for it to be more than 1,000 words or 1,000 words. It makes sense to have that because it's enough time to get into it. But the whole notion of 8,000 words means this kind of, you know, scholarly work, or 3,000 words means this kind of scholarly work. We know it's nonsense. All of us who've worked in the academy for years know that that is nonsense. And so being able to disrupt that in meaningful ways is important, and being able to get the material out in a timely fashion is why we're moving into the rolling process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, I had a journal article come out a couple of weeks ago that was from my PhD, and my PhD was finished 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And you know, it's not a criticism against the journal. It's just saying that actually my ideas have shifted so much, as you know, from, you know, writing in a space about Black women especially, and it's shifted across lots of different areas. It's shifted from to the non-binary space. It's shifted in understanding leadership. It's shifted in understanding intersectionality, all those sorts of things. I'm not ashamed of the work, but it's important, I think, for scholars, especially younger scholars that are just starting to communicate their ideas, to be able to get these ideas out, you know, in a timely fashion, so that they can revisit those later on when they might have produced other knowledge, or sort of that might have done a bit more reading, a bit more understanding of the work, and be able to sort of say, actually, previously I wrote this. This is now an interrogation of what I wrote and why I wrote it, and how I've shifted. You know, I think those sorts of things are really important. In talking about the creative work, you know, I mean, for me, the power of story is immense. And I'm really conscious when I have these conversations that I'm not saying, I'm making sure that I'm not delegitimizing story as, you know, as method, as analysis. That's the stuff that I think sometimes gets lost. And I don't, that's not where I'm coming from. And yeah, I think those sorts of things are really important, as well as that in talking about things like making sure that it's not, as you said, like a conversation that you have at the beginning that you can tick off and go, okay, I've done the acknowledgement, now I can move on to unrelated things. My way of being is to try and tread gently through the earth, and that's my philosophy. But also, I'm on, Wiradjuri country here in and it's not my country. I'm a Birapai woman, so being conscious of the fact that this is not my space, honouring that space by walking gently and trying to be as humble as I can in that space, and making sure that other people have opportunity, to speak and to use their knowledge wisely. That's my way of being, and it's also my way of leadership. If we're going to get back into talking about leading and presiding over an association. And so I've always wanted to sort of make sure that we are sharing and we're not excluding and we're not, overriding and all of that sort of stuff. The idea of the journal being sort of a more rolling sort of journal, to me, fits in perfectly with that, because we want to make sure that ACRAWSA is built and is having conversations with younger and emerging scholars, as well as, the scholars that we know have given so many years of service into the production of knowledge. So all of that kind of, I think you and I are on the same page in having those discussions. And I think we could actually, produce something really quite powerful in the building of that space.
Yeah, I agree. And it's lovely to kind of see the history of these spaces and to see them. It's not about transforming, because everything that's ever happened across, as an example, the ACRAWSA space, but also across so much space that's talking about critical race has been powerful. Every moment is powerful. Like every bit of writing, you just want to engage with it, and every bit of thought you want to engage with. And so the idea of being able to have a whole journey of transformation of that, that's about everyday transformations, not about like this is all new, but about going every day is new, and every day is is a remaking in that way. And I know that that who we are, I'm a Wiradjuri person, and being engaged in thinking about Wiradjuri language for the first time in a long time, I've started to think about some of those meanings. So while I'm a scholar who has a lot of experience in a lot of areas, I don't in that area. And so I suddenly think, wow, how will that grow my understanding of myself? I'm not talking about my work. I'm just talking about how will that grow that? How will it grow my understanding of my family? And it's exciting to get into that. And so I hope that people who aren't just thinking about scholarship are also able to engage with some of the material. Sometimes it's hard to engage with because, I'm just going to like wear it that sometimes I write in an inaccessible way. I'm trying to challenge that in my writing. But, others I know you would say that too about themselves, or maybe they even make that choice to do that, but because it's required, because, it's a kind of sophisticated set of ideas that otherwise you have to lay out a whole lot of groundwork for it. But at the same time, I think there's going to be a lot of accessible material on there as well. And I love the idea of this being a space that is freely accessible. It's the biggest barrier. If I think about my work, 90% of it is behind a paywall. Work that I've done over the years that's not creative practice work has been, or reports, has been behind a paywall and really inaccessible to your average person or to a student when they finish at an institution, or for people between institutions who work in them. And I hate that. I think it's a dreadful space. It's also, required in a lot of ways. So it's not only a criticism of the system, it's just kind of a frustration of being engaged in. So I love that. But, you know, it will rely, because there will be labour involved with this, it will rely on people being able to do that peer review work and for us to be able to do the shaping of it. So so we've just had a situation where, obviously, in the reforming and the reshaping, we're thinking about how the journal is going to move forward. And of course, all the groundwork is brilliant already. So we actually realise nothing needs to change in terms of the writing of the shape of it. It's really just around submission and then expectations of outcomes, which is great, but also I think just highlights the work of the editorial boards of the, you know, of the past, and highlights the work of you know, of past presidents, and just the executive as a whole. So yeah, so it's I'm really grateful for that, and grateful to have an opportunity to contribute to this. And I think one of the things that we'd talked about, Tess totally talked about the concerns with it, was the fact that, you know, neither of us had traditionally come into that space of being critical race scholars. But again, you know, I think there is an emerging argument that if you're not doing critical race, that's been led by ACRAWSA, that if you're not doing critical race in areas that concern humans, then what are you doing? Like, why aren't you? You know, and that this is an opportunity to understand how you might, you know. So it's not a criticism of people who are out there not doing it. It's an opportunity to kind of engage across the disciplines with some of that material. And I think honestly, historically for me, the journal always provided that. You know, there were always these amazing opportunities to be able to engage in that way. And the not being behind a paywall always meant that the ACRAWSA journal was well cited as well. Which, and citing matters because it's a strategy for emerging, you know, scholars to kind of get their work out there. But it's not just that. It matters because it means that people can read it. So,
yeah. I mean, it's really interesting talking about, I guess, you know, language that people might not necessarily be able to read and understand. I think that's why a lot of, especially Black scholars, you know, write for places like Indigenous X, and you know, I've done work, you know, in those sorts of areas, mostly so that I can still speak my voice, but speak in a way that, you know, might be better understood, and gets the point across in, you know, sometimes 800 word count rather than a 3,000 to 5,000 words. But I think all of that sort of work is really important, and I think being able to work in this space with regards to the journal, I mean, I've already got ideas in my head of, you know, of things that I want to see written, and, you know, I was also thinking about this year in terms of the Black Lives Matter protests, and, you know, it's one of the things that I have been really conscious of, especially even within our own committee, that there is trauma work going on at the moment, and I'm conscious of making sure that people are looking after themselves if they want to do the work and they want to write the pieces and what sorts of that's, I commend them for that. But if they're feeling like there's a push for them, you know, to have to do that sort of stuff, I'm very, very conscious and I'm self-aware of what I'm capable of at that particular moment. And there's times when I don't vocalise, you know, or put any commentary out there with an issue that's happening, be it about race, about universities, or anything really, because I'm conscious of making sure that I'm checking in with all those closed rooms that are in my mind of past trauma, and, you know, do I want to open all of those doors at once? So I want the space to be really caring in making sure that we are protecting people and letting them express in the ways in which that they want to express, so that, you know, if it's an artistic or creative space that they want to, you know, produce their knowledge, you know, checking in and making sure that that's what they want to do, that there's no pressure in that. I'm not saying that that's necessarily different from other, you know, other theoretical journal spaces, but I just think it's really important to put out there so that our members know that there's not there. Let's just forget about expectations for a moment and think about us, you know, in terms of humanity and making sure that we're looking after each and every one of us, you know.
Absolutely, and I think there's often it's pitted against, just like creative practice is often pitted against an idea of whether it's rigorous or not, and the R word, as we say, and it's a nonsense. You know, that is a part of peer review. Actually, you know, part of peer review is to say, let's actually look at this, so we can still have peer review in those processes, and still ensure. In fact, I would argue that it's a little more compelling in that space, because it's not only a kind of reproductive space that's about shaping in that same way as the acknowledgement and the idea of it, you know, being a tick box. It can actually be something that is looked at anew. Does it mean a little bit more work? Maybe. We'll see. But also, I just really want to acknowledge that you've been amazing in, you know, this year of both not putting the pressure on at the same time as setting up some really clear guidance, because it's no mean feat to do both of those things. And I don't think, I've learned a lot from this process, and I'm going to be absolutely honest and say I was arrogant enough to think that I wasn't going to learn that much out of it. And you know, I kind of smacked myself about it. I also had thought that the gender work that I do, even though I know that it's very connected to, it's a challenge to the Colonial Project, it's very connected to critical race work, I thought that sat on the outside. And it was through conversations that we'd had, and that we'd had more broadly, including on Twitter, you know, so in a public sphere, that let me know that this wasn't the case, you know, that this was a much more open set of conversations, and it was a powerful, it was really powerful. And so I want to both acknowledge that, but also just when people are talking about, for instance, where this fits within the new Excellence in Research for Australia, the new era structure, we don't know what that's going to look like. What we know is that there are new field of research codes and new SEOs, and you know, I think that what we understand at the moment is that it's going to fit within a range of those 2-digit codes and probably a number of the 4-digit. And if you don't know what I mean by 2 4-digit and you're interested in Australian academic work, we'll be putting out some material about this from ACRAWSA. We'll be shaping some of the understandings from our perspective, and hopefully it'll help people to understand where it fits. But also, you know, I think there's been a lot of push for talking about quality journals, and I think there is an important conversation to be had about how few interdisciplinary journals hit that mark, whatever the quality is, and how many single disciplinary, regardless of the quality, do hit that. And there is an understanding of that across a lot of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary areas. And so I think they're conversations that we need to continue to be a part of. I know that Alana Lenton had done a lot of work last year and the year before in her role as president in framing some of the work that was important for ERA. I think what we've got to do with the journal, but also with just getting people to understand that belonging to associations doesn't have to be about some rarefied space of privilege. It's about connecting with people.
Yeah, definitely. And excuse me, whilst that's, you know, been made a little bit more complicated in the hellfire that is 2020, it's important to recognise that, you know, I feel that the membership at the moment, you know, we've had conversations about making sure that members feel looked after. And I know that in the previous newsletter I have written that if anyone was struggling because of the economic downturn that is happening and the precarity that exists to give us a bell. But because we're not necessarily, spending money, on travel and conferences and things like that at the moment, it's definitely a model that needs to be looked at with regards to paying for memberships. But I think also with providing the rolling journal, at least, there's some great sort of work that will be going out there. And I also don't want people to think that there hasn't been anything happening, because there's been a fair bit of advocacy that's had to happen this year with regards to the Dan Tien announcement that actually got passed through yesterday. So, there's been some work that's been behind the scenes, which unfortunately it doesn't sort of appear to be front facing. But membership doesn't necessarily matter with regards to that. We just want members to feel, I guess, connected, as you said, and cared for, because I know that a lot of those might be students or they might be in precarious employment. So I just wanted to put that out there,
And I think the caring stuff is something that we've talked about, and it's important, and not but and. So is, as you say, that whole preparation for the next stages that people have in their work with everything that's changed. And I've got to say, I have no question that being a part of ACRAWSA was one of the reasons that I was successful in getting the Future Fellowship. Just the credibility of the organisation. I think it's true in terms of, I'm wearing an Indigenous X t-shirt. I think it's true in terms of connection to Indigenous X as well. I think, and I don't mean connection to like, oh, I mentioned it. So I mean the work that you do within those spaces and the way that you value it, and you bring up that value by talking about the other people that are involved with it. Obviously, organisations aren't an organisation; they're the people who constitute it. And I love that we're not really sure of all of those people. Or sorry, I should just speak for myself. I love that I'm not really sure of who all those people are. And I guess part of what we're trying to do is to understand it through the journal and to understand it through other forms. And so to that end, one of the things that we talked about is, I know you've got some interviews, or it's not interviews, it's kind of sessions of discussion. I could call them yarning sessions, but sometimes that's a bit of a term that gets used to, I always worry about the idea of just reframing everything as yarning in that context, because that's there's a complexity and a gorgeous complexity to the notion of yarning, and actually really these are maybe that and maybe not, depending on what you're doing. So yeah, I don't want to just deploy that unproblematically. Here's me with my caveats about everything. But I do think that that idea of a 5-minute piece or a 10-minute piece, like Tess, neither of us are capable of doing any sort of yarning that's 5 or 10 minutes, but a 20-minute piece, an hour-long piece, if it's something that's kind of meaty, being able to talk to people who are enacting some of that remarkable work that's out there in the world. And I know you've got a writer who's you're going to be talking to. I don't know if you can announce who it is yet, but they've just recently had a book out, and it's a remarkable book that I spent a whole lot of time with, and at the end of last week when I really needed it, and so I'm really excited to hear their thoughts, your thoughts, and I think they're opportunities. But maybe if you're still looking at this now, then maybe you're one of those people who wants to come in for a convo, and it doesn't have to be a one-on-one. It can be few people having a discussion. But why not? Why don't we do this? And have ways to engage. And this is kind of where we're at the moment.
So, some people might not necessarily like to be on Zoom, and I must admit I'm a little bit of a technophobe, so I'm not a podcaster, but I'm happy to sort of have those conversations without vision.
That's right. Sorry, I should have said that. That yeah, we'll do them as podcasts too, because sometimes it can just be really, it can be really tricky. So yeah.
Yeah, and speaking of that, we actually have a podcast that will be coming up soon, which is of the conference that was held in February, which also features, our keynote speaker, and there's a few sort of sound bites from people that were at the conference. And so, that's a really nice, connection, and it also acknowledges the previous work that the committee had done, because I sort of just came on just after that. So definitely not going to ride on their coattails, but I think stuff like that can be really beneficial, because it just keeps people connected to the conversations, but also to the people. And I think it's important that we, I would love to have some student conversations with people that are sort of early on in their study careers with regards to this work and what their impressions are. I think things like that are really important, to just broaden, not broaden the field, but just broaden the area in which we're including, people that might want to have really specific discussions that they feel that they're not necessarily a part of. People that work in the activism space, I think, are hugely important. And so there's definitely a lot of scope there. And if people are interested, I'd love for them to contact me. I won't put them on to everybody else, but I'm happy to accept the emails and have a further discussion on what they might want to do.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thanks for having this discussion today. Hopefully it's helpful for people who are both thinking about how we're looking at growing this space, but also what roles you can have out there in the world in this. And it is to suggest that without you, it's nothing. Without people engaging with the material, either as makers or as just people who value being able to engage with it. It's nothing. So I think that's what this year has shown us, is that sorry unis, but you have to actually maintain your relevance. And also, isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful, unis? You have to maintain your relevance. And so I think there's there's a very powerful kind of message that ACRAWSA is actually across, or capable of being across. So and has been across this year. So thank you for all of that. We're going to try and do as much social media. We've just been talking about a bit of a social media plan for how we're going to get information out there, and also just how we can start to grow membership. And I hope it's understood that I'm not talking about income here, but grow the idea of a network that that ACRAWSA can be.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sandy, and thank you everyone out there, and stay well and safe.